BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. What we're going to do today on the channel is to have a reiteration of a discussion that we did back in 2019. There are a couple reasons for this. First and foremost, it's great for me to talk about the case of Annika Östberg once again. I think it's an absolutely enthralling and compelling subject. And also, yesterday on the channel, we were having a discussion about an individual named Paul Martin Andrews, who was a victim of rape and sexual abuse. And he really became a victims' rights advocate, challenging a lot of things in the legal system and such. And some of the legal questions that he was proposing are quite similar to what we're going to see in the case of Annika Östberg. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is sometimes we make these recordings here for Black Box Online Radio, and perhaps we think maybe we would just like to have another shot at it. So this is a reiteration of a discussion back from 2019, as we said, and without further ado, let's get started. Today we're going to be going back to 1981 to discuss a couple different murders that happened within a span of 24 hours involving an individual named Annika Östberg, who you see in the title here, as well as her boyfriend at the time, Bob Cox. This case gets attention on the internet for a couple different reasons. First and foremost is because it's somewhat international. Annika Östberg was a Swedish national, born in Stockholm, Sweden, and in Hässelby, which I think is at the end of the line on their underground, the metro. And then she came to the United States because her mother married an American. And Annika did not take a strong liking to her stepfather. She did not take a strong liking to having to move to America, but she moved to California. And this was at the age of 10. And even when she did a TEDx talk at the Swedish School of Economics, you can find it online. She did a TEDx talk, TEDx SSE, Swedish School of Economics. She even said that it was around 10 or 11, like how childhood memories, you don't even remember the exact times very clearly. But around 10 or 11, she goes to California, living with her stepfather, and that is the beginning of the teen years. And for Annika Östberg, she went down a pathway of a lot of dysfunction, we can say. She became addicted to heroin. She got pregnant at age 16. She was a runaway. Many different dysfunctional steps happened. Now, one of the things that would happen with Annika Östberg is that she would get involved with that individual we mentioned, Robert Cox, also known as Bob Cox. And they developed a couple of illegal schemes to make money. One of them was selling stolen meat. What they would do is they would steal meat and then they would sell it to suppliers for restaurants. I can only understand that this would be that they must be selling it at some type of below market value or selling it with a price cut so that people would buy it from them in their shady method as opposed to a more legitimate method. But one night, Annika Östberg was going into a truck to get some of the stolen meat to sell to an individual named Joe Torre. However, Bob Cox and Annika decided to take this illegal scheme to another level. Annika pretended to go into the truck to get something, but in reality, she was just being a distraction for Joe Torre, the individual who was supposed to buy the stolen meat. And then Bob Cox pulled out a firearm and shot Joe Torre, killing him. And this became the first murder that we would see in this 24-hour period. But that's an important detail to note. Annika was an active participant in this, but she did not pull the trigger. She did not do any of the direct actions that ended a person's life, because this is going to affect things like prison sentencing. And how do we explore this subject? As they began to flee the scene, within 24 hours, they were on the run. Their car even broke down. They were stopped by a police officer, or a police officer came to the scene, and because they had murdered someone, they were very much in fear for their lives, or they were fear of being arrested. So what happened was Annika pretended to look into her belongings for her ID, and while she was distracting the police officer, Bob Cox shot the officer, and his name was Sergeant Hellbush, and he also passed away from the injuries that he received. He was also murdered. So they had these two murders that took place within a span of 24 hours. And this is when Annika really describes it as the end of her life as she knows it, as she knew it. And it really was a different chapter into life, but eventually Annika and Bob Cox would be caught. They would be arrested. And for a while, they were trying to give Annika Östberg the death penalty. People were calling for the death penalty. They were like, she is as good as guilty in every aspect of the murder. I mean, she should face the death penalty because, number one, she was an active participant in 2 murders. Number two, she was involved with the murder of a police officer, which the law and order of California did not take a liking to. And also, people really took a disliking to the situation because the first murder, the murder of Joe Torre, distracting him, luring him there on the premise that they're going to sell him stolen meat. There are just so many deceptive, illegal, and immoral elements going on. They're like, it was done purely for selfishness. It was done purely out of greed. It was done because of dysfunction and abuse were getting out of control. And Joe Torre, the victim, had to pay the price, as well as, of course, Sergeant Hellbush, who would go on to pass away later on. Now, if we jump over here to a website that we don't talk about too frequently on this channel, even though we mention a lot of true crime cases, this is Murderpedia. And they have some things here that are written about the sentence of Annika Östberg, just to read a little bit here. In 1983, Annika Östberg received a sentence of 25 years to life for the 1981 murders. At the time, it was customary for well-behaved prisoners to be set free after serving approximately half of their sentence. Documents from that period indicate that Östberg's lawyers believed that she could get out after 12 and a half years. Previously, life prisoners served their sentences according to the law and their behavior in prison. However, this was not the case after 2000. Politics changed throughout the years, and as the sentencing laws changed, so did the mindset of the Board of Prison Terms in the governor's office in Sacramento. And about this 12-year thing, we used to talk about the show I Survived from time to time. I've never done a specific response to it here on this channel, Black Box Online Radio, but what I would say is that we mentioned this one because we brought up a case where one man was sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder of a woman. And what she said on the show I Survived was, in California, life in prison means 12 years. And I was like, she has said it so bluntly. I mean, I had even heard of this case of Annika Östberg. We talked about it on the channel previously. Before I had heard that episode of I Survived, I downloaded the podcast from podcast1.com, but it is an A&E show. So I was just like, just when she laid it out that bluntly, I just didn't quite comprehend how it worked. And this lays it out very nicely here. If somebody is sentenced 25 to life, they can get that cut in half for good behavior, or they could at the time. Now, I mean, we don't really need to talk about California politics. I'm sure enough people are already doing that, but the rules in California change very frequently. The laws in California change very frequently. Perhaps you've heard of something about the Manson family. All of those people were sentenced to death, and then their sentences were commuted to life in prison. Then they brought the death penalty back, but the commuted sentences remain, and that's why people like Charles Manson and the Manson family remained in prison for life. That's why they were not executed, because the laws in California just changed this way and that from time to time. And Annika Östberg was also somebody who was affected by this. And she said this material here that we just read off from Murderpedia almost verbatim in her TEDx talk, when she was saying that she agreed to the terms because they really thought that she was going to be getting out in 12 years or 12 and a half years. And for somebody who had just committed a murder or been an active participant in 2 murders, this really is one of the reasons why it's important to talk about these types of cases, because they're just like, well, what do we do with this person? This person who was, well, are they equally guilty as a person like Bob Cox, who pulled the trigger, who delivered the fatal shot, who was holding the smoking gun? Is somebody like Annika Östberg, who was just the distraction? But another point we should mention is, during the attempted arrest, she also did help Bob Cox reload the gun as police officers were trying to arrest them. However, once again, she did not deliver any of the fatal shots. She was simply the distraction, as well as being a part of an accomplice to other crimes, such as stealing meat and selling them to people who were restaurant suppliers. She was involved with lots of illegal activity, let alone heroin possession. She did many illegal things, but when you want to talk about the murders in a very specific way, this is the important question to ask. Should she have been given life in prison or the death penalty if she did not deliver any of the fatal shots? Well, what happened is eventually that, if I recall what she said, that there would be a Supreme Court ruling that said if she did not indeed deliver the fatal action or deliver the action that killed somebody, then she could not receive the death penalty, but she could still receive life in prison. And I would like to jump over to a section here called the Swedish reactions, because I think that this is one of the reasons why we have these types of questions, because Sweden, where Annika Östberg was a national of, or her home country, the land of her birth, they have a completely different justice system, and they have a different response to situations like this. And we're just going to read a little bit here. The Annika Östberg case upset many people in Sweden since it claimed that she was not armed, which the narrative follows, and did not commit any murder. Well, I mean, that's why we're asking these questions. I mean, that's arguable, we can say. The Swedish media claimed that she was not only present on the scene and did not do anything except be a scapegoat for her boyfriend, who committed suicide before his trial. There's the end of Bob Cox. It was written that she would not get any penalty at all if she was in Sweden. Relatives had contacted the media, and this version was initially used as they had trouble getting information from California. Later, the Swedish media admitted to her having a higher degree of involvement in this episode. She implied that she committed the killings in statements to the police. She confessed to avoid the death penalty, which would have been hard if she had actually shot the victims. So yes, I mean, the consistent narrative that we have established and that Annika has reiterated and that the police seem somewhat satisfied with is, once again, she was the distraction. She walked into the back of a truck to distract Joe Torre so that Bob Cox could shoot him. And once again, she distracted the police officer by reaching around looking for her ID to show him so Bob Cox could shoot Sergeant Hellbush. There has been criticism against the Swedish media, also in Sweden, who has decided to protect a Swedish woman who has got harsh treatment by foreign authorities. The criticism says that the media has avoided to describe what she did during the event. Swedish media could not avoid writing in a way that was giving it away to readers in Sweden. The well-known police academy of Leif G.W. Persson. The well-known police academy professor Leif G.W. Persson said, "She is a very heavy criminal. Media has touched that very gently. I assume that is because they want her to be released. Then it is hard to do a correct description of the case." Okay, let's look here at a very particular line in this. If we look at the beginning of that sentence, the Annika Östberg case upset many Swedes since it claimed she was not armed and she did not commit any murder. Well, in the United States of America, things do not always work like that. Active participants in homicides can often be charged with murder. I mean, anybody who follows true crime cases will see this time and time again throughout the literature, the documentaries, the podcast. No matter where you want to get your information, you will see this pattern. And back when we were talking about the case of Dr. O.C. Smith recently on this channel, he was a medical examiner, but one of the people that he was testifying against in a court case was someone who was charged with murder. And he was saying that there's no possible way that he could have murdered this person because this guy was robbing a fast food restaurant. And he claimed that a stray bullet or a bullet that had been fired by a police officer who was trying to subdue him had accidentally killed another police officer, and he was being charged for the murder of that police officer. Guess what? That happens all the time. I mean, that does. If somebody creates the illegal situation, and I think that this affects an enormous amount of other laws, but I kid thee not, I have, seen this on other true crime programs where if somebody creates the illegal situation and then another person dies because of the events that happen in the illegal situation that they created, they are charged with murder. And people even use the example once of if a bank robber gets into a fight with the police, gets into a gunfight, a shooting match with the police, and one of the bullets hits a hostage in the bank or hits somebody in the bank who is not participating in the crime, the bank robber can be charged with murder. And I'm sure we can find some examples that perhaps we can talk about in a future upload. But the whole point is, in the United States of America, the law works in a very tricky way. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just some guy who watches true crime programs and reads articles and listens to TED Talks like the one from Annika Östberg, TEDxSSE, if you'd like to hear it. But I can say that we see this happen, though, when they're just also, like, she is so involved with this situation that how is she not guilty of murder? But one of the other counterclaims is, okay, she confessed. She also did her time and after committing the crime. And it's like she spent 28 years in prison. And because of the way the Swedish justice system is structured, as you heard there, if she were in Sweden, she would have had a much lighter sentence. 28 years in prison. She spent more time in prison than almost any other Swedish national on the planet Earth at the time. I mean, that was a very abnormally long sentence for a Swedish national. If we look at the Nordic world and like a neighbor of Sweden, Norway, the Norwegian bomber Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 77 people back in 2011, was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Annika Östberg served 28 before. So what happened was she was extradited back to Sweden, and eventually she was released from prison. And we can actually jump over and find out just some more of those exact specifics about what happened with that. If we look at the transfer to Sweden, the question of being transferred to Sweden to a Swedish prison is outside the scope of a parole hearing that California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger refused in an interview in 2005 with Swedish television to let her be transferred to Sweden to serve the remaining period in her native country. So Arnold was against that. In April 2009, she was finally transferred after years of silent diplomatic activity. It is believed that the financial crisis in the United States of America and the fact that prisoners are a burden on the economy was one of the reasons for the transfer. Just a quick interjection. What Annika Östberg said in her own words was she entered into the California Correctional Institute for Women, and what happened was that facility was supposed to be holding 900 people. Throughout the duration of her sentence, throughout the decade that she spent there, it expanded to 3,000 inmates in a facility that was meant for 900. So that is one of the things that they were talking about. Östberg became one of the first prisoners to be transferred under the new rules and the new laws. Once again, California always changing the rules and laws. On November 16th, 2009, a Swedish court decided that her life sentence should be time limited so that she can be released in May of 2011, more than 30 years after her arrest. On August 8th, 2010, Östberg hosted the program Sommar, Sommar, on Sveriges Radio. Please excuse my mispronunciation of that word. She was released on May 2nd, 2011, after having been locked up for 30 years, since May 1st, 1981, a longer prison term than almost any Swedish citizen. And there we go, saying that right there. Okay. So, as you see, she was extradited back to Sweden, and then they were able to shorten her sentence, and she was let out after roughly 30 years in prison. I think they mean 28 in America, and then the remaining years in Sweden before she was finally released and becoming a free woman. And a lot of tragedies happened in her life. That is one thing, and that is one thing nobody disputes. Her son, we mentioned she got pregnant at age 16. Her son passed away at the age of 10 in a car accident. The car was struck by a drunk driver, and the father of her son had a heart attack the same day because of the events, learning the news of the passing of his son. He also passed away, as well as some of the events in prison, being addicted to heroin, getting addicted to heroin while in prison, many, many tragedies. And one of the things she said that really helped her was pet therapy and the connections to animals, and as well as the bonding experiences with some of the other inmates. But she has a lot to say about pet theory and helping train animals for service usage, and there are some things that come about that. But when we mentioned yesterday that there were some questions we had to ask, what is the purpose of prison? Because there's a German writer named Jens Söring who was talking all about not only rehabilitation, but also reintroduction, reintegration. Like prisons can reintegrate people into society. That should be a primary objective. But one of the responses is not only reintegration, but prisons can also be a place for punishment for people who do very heinous things. And many of the victims will never be the same. I mean, the families of Sergeant Hellbush and the family of Joe Torre will never get their family member back. And we really just aren't even 100% sure. There is not a clear line on this is how it exactly has to be. if the person is rehabilitated, do you just let them go? I mean, I'm sure some people get rehabilitated very quickly, maybe even a few weeks or months into their life sentence. They might never kill again. Maybe they would never even kill again from the beginning, and it's just a horrendous mistake in their life. But should they still be let off? These questions are very challenging. And the case of Annika Östberg really raised a lot of questions because, first and foremost, we can say she did not deliver the fatal shot that killed these gentlemen. But the second thing we can say is she was an active participant in this, and she aided and abetted the individual in a very functional way, in a very conscious and calculating way to have these men murdered. So what happened is that she did spend 30 years in prison. I mean, if there's anything, I would say that 30 years in prison is somewhat of a fair sentence for being an active participant in the murder. But what do you have to say about this situation? Do you think that prisons are more for rehabilitation and then like reintegrating a person into society? Or do you think that prisons are more of a place for punishment where you did something bad, you did the crime, now you have to do the time, as basic as that sentence is? What do you have to say about that? And we can also ask one final challenge question. Do you believe that the sentence that Annika Östberg carried out was fair, spending 30 years in prison for being an active participant and an accomplice in the murders of Joe Torre and Sergeant Hillbush? I would love to hear any comments that you have to say. I would love to read your comments in the section below. All right, well, that's all for me now. And I will see you guys on Instagram for the bonus podcast. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, please drop some comments in the section below. See you on Instagram, and until next time.